By the end of this story, the most feared commander in the kingdom will kneel in the dirt before a single green sprout, and he will still not fully understand why. Cold woke him first, not winter cold, empty cold, as if the air itself had forgotten what warmth ever meant. He opened his eyes to a flat gray sky, and it was already wrong. The wagon's plank shook beneath his back with every rut in the road. This was not his body. Thin arms, long pale fingers, a stranger's hands. He raised his palm and saw it glowing there, faint and gray, shaped like a sprout of wheat. Not a tattoo. A mark. Alive, pulsing like a second heartbeat under the skin. He sat up too fast and the world spun. The driver up front never turned around. Horses trudged on, dragging the cart through nothing but ashen silence. No trees, no grass, no color at all. The ground stretched gray in every direction, burned flat and forgotten. Far east, a thin red line glowed on the horizon, to be a sunset. It looked like an old scar left on the skin of the world. He didn't understand it yet, but the body he was wearing did. That line was a wound, a tear in the earth that had been bleeding monsters for 60 years. And in his mind sat memories that weren't his, stacked like letters written by a stranger. The name attached to this body was Dan Kieran, 17 years old, youngest son of a family with nothing left to lose. 3 days ago this boy had knelt for the rite of awakening and received a gift. Farming, the gray gift. The most shameful talent a person could be born with in this world. His father wouldn't look at him. His mother wept, but only for herself. His brother said he would have been better off stillborn. Then came the travel order. Corrective farming, plot 47 of the Harrow Wastelands. Indefinite. Indefinite meant forever. Forever meant die out there and don't come back. The panic lasted 3 breaths. On the 4th, he forced himself to think. Because the last thing he remembered was a highway in Oregon and jazz on the radio. Then darkness, then this wagon, this stranger's skin, this dead gray world. He leaned over the side and pinched a bit of soil between his fingers. Dusty. Loose. No smell of anything alive in it. But underneath, in the dark, something waited quietly. The dirt warmed against his palm, as if the gift inside him were trying to say something. Highly alkaline, dead to the eye. Not hopeless to a man who knew soil. He'd worked fields exactly like this for 4 years back in Oregon. Saline ground left behind by wildfires. Everyone there had said nothing would ever grow again. Everyone there had been wrong. The cart driver finally stopped and turned around, an old face with empty, tired eyes. He nodded toward a crooked stone shack with a rotted straw roof and no glass in the window. He dropped a sack in the dirt without climbing down. If the boy died before winter, they'd send another one out. If he lived, well, that was his own problem. The wagon creaked away and the silence swallowed it whole. He stood there alone with a bundle of hardtack, a sack of government seeds, and nothing else for kilometers. Then he dropped to his knees, pressed his palm flat against the gray dust, and felt the seal on his hand flare to life. Not the surface, the depth. 1 meter, 2, 5, dead layer after dead layer. And at 6 meters down, something pulsed, faint, barely alive. Water. Ancient groundwater no one had ever sensed, because no one here knew how to listen to the earth this deeply. He pulled his hand back and looked at the shack, the sack, the empty horizon. And for the first time since waking in a stranger's body, he smiled. Gray soil, high alkalinity, zero competition. Water 6 meters down. To anyone else, a death sentence. To him, a clean slate. Inside the hut was exactly what he expected. Dirt floor, cracked walls, a plank bed, a rusted bucket. No tools, no bowls. The people sent here were never meant to come back. He walked his new plot, 3 acres of ash-colored nothing, and rubbed handfuls of it between his fingers. Dormant, not poisoned. The mineral base was intact. This land wasn't dead. It was only sleeping. Near the eastern wall he found the only living thing on the entire plot. A half-withered blackthorn bush, 3 living branches out of 10. The kind any local would burn as trash. He placed his palm against its trunk, and the mark on his hand flared brighter than it had all day. He saw it, not with his eyes. Roots driving 6 meters straight down through dead ground to reach water no one else could find. This bush hadn't just survived the wasteland. It had conquered it alone for decades. He sat beside it and pulled a handful of pale government seeds from the sack. Then he understood exactly what he was about to do, and why no one here had ever done it before. Not because he was a much, not because he was chosen, because he knew how roots worked. He knew what symbiosis meant. Give wheat the roots of a blackthorn, and it would reach water no wheat had ever touched. He pressed the seeds against the trunk, closed his eyes, and did the one thing he was good at in either world. And so he began to grow, right there in the dust. Warmth flowed from his palm into the bark, and from the bark into the seeds curled against it. Root depth, waxy cuticle, bitter tannins that no pest could stomach. Traits crossed from one plant into another, a laboratory built entirely out of his own hands. By nightfall he collapsed onto the cot, still in his clothes, and didn't dream at all. In the morning he stepped outside and froze in the doorway. A ring of wheat had risen overnight around the blackthorn bush, dark stalks standing tall as a grown man. 20 square meters of living grain in the middle of a plot that was supposed to kill him. The first harvest this land had seen in 3 generations, and he had grown it in a single night. He laughed, quietly, a little madly, standing alone in a field that shouldn't exist. They sent him here to die. Instead, he was about to feed a kingdom that had thrown him away. The days that followed were not glamorous. They were compost, and ash, and aching hands. He needed nutrients back in the soil before his own accelerated growth burned through what little remained. For 3 days he gathered every scrap of dead matter he could find, dry stalks, lichen, hearth ash, anything that had ever been alive. He built his first compost pit and fed it warmth from his palm, not for the plants this time, but for the bacteria hiding inside the dirt. 2 days later he had his first bucket of black, living compost, and the field grew to 40 square meters. The blackthorn stood at the center of it all like a sentry standing guard over something worth protecting. On the 8th day he woke to a sound he hadn't heard since arriving. Footsteps. Someone was walking the northern trail, slow and unsteady. The walk of a person who keeps moving only because stopping means giving up. A woman with dirty red hair reached the edge of the wheat field and stopped dead. She stared at the grain as if she were looking at a ghost, then looked at him, then collapsed face first into the stalks. He turned her over. Cracked lips, burning fever, a torn military uniform stripped of every insignia. On the back of her left hand glowed a golden seal, to stems entwined around a single drop. A healer's gift, a battle-grade gift, exactly the kind that never ends up abandoned in a place like this. Which meant only one thing. She hadn't been sent here. She had run. And desertion from the front, in this world, was punished with a rope round the neck. He carried her inside anyway, gave her half his water, and went out to find a cure with nothing but wheat and blackthorn to work with. He wasn't a chemist. He was an agronomist, and he thought in roots, not chemicals. He grafted a wild seed into a fever-breaking herb in a single afternoon, boiled the leaves into a bitter green tea, and poured it past her cracked lips. By evening her fever had broken. By night, her eyes opened. She asked where she was. He told her, Plot 47, correctional farming, a 3-day walk from anyone who might come looking. She asked why he hadn't turned her away. Deserters got hanged for less than shelter. He said there was no one out here to hang her, and frankly, he needed the extra hands more than he needed her secrets. She was silent a long time, then she gave him her name. Mayra O'Shea, field medic, 6 frontier corps, for years on the front line. She said her gift could put a dying man back on his feet in an hour, and command would send him back into the fighting that same afternoon. She'd watched the same faces die on rotation until one night, 2 months ago, she simply walked away and never looked back. He handed her a piece of bread made from his own bitter blackthorn wheat and said nothing at all. She asked what kind of grain it was. He told her he'd grown it himself from nothing, in a matter of days. She looked at the gray mark on his palm for a long moment, her face unreadable. In the morning she stood on the porch, looked out at the field, and told him she was staying. He handed her a bucket without a word of celebration, her first job, hauling ash to the compost pile. She took it and started working, and didn't ask why. He did not know it yet, but the choice she made that morning would decide who lived to see what came next. Within 2 weeks they had cleared another 20 square meters together, him sewing, her hauling water from a trick he'd learned by accident. He discovered that if he asked the blackthorn's roots for water instead of forcing them, they pumped it upward faster on their own. Mayra watched this happen and said, without much emotion, that and for years on the front she'd seen dozens of gifts, and every single one of them destroyed something. His gift was the first one she'd ever seen that only created. That night, helping him plant beans in the dark, her hands were softer than they'd been all week. He began experimenting further, this time fusing 3 plants at once instead of 2. Chasing something he needed badly, nitrogen returned to dead soil. It took him a full day, and left him shaking. But by morning a low green carpet had crept across a full square meter of gray dirt. Mayra asked what he'd call it. He thought of an old joke from a life she couldn't understand and said, an office rug. She didn't ask what an office was. He didn't explain. That night he lay awake doing the math in his head. Potassium, phosphorus. Winter coming in 2 months if the old memories in this body were right. Grow what's under your feet, figure out what's in your hands, and keep going. That plan had never once let him down. Rain came in the 4th month, gray and warm and tasting faintly of ash. But it was still water falling from the sky instead of pulled up from below. He stood in it with his face turned upward, already thinking about ditches, reservoirs, some way to catch what the sky was finally giving them. A week later, a second traveler wandered onto the farm. A skinny boy of about 15 with a gray gift called calculation. Useless by every noble standard in the kingdom. He could count anything in his line of sight instantly, grains in an ear of wheat, steps to the horizon, numbers no one had ever asked him to use for something that mattered. His name was Tyron, and his own family had disowned him the moment his gift came back gray. The farmer put him to work counting roots instead of coins, and the boy's eyes went blank for a second before he gave back a number that was exactly, perfectly correct. 2 days after that, an old man named Ren arrived, carrying the gift of purity, a talent so despised back home that people called it the laundress's curse. He could scrub filth from anything with a touch, and no one before this farm had ever thought to ask him to clean water instead of dishes. 10 seconds after he tried, a bucket of murky underground water turned crystal clear, and a 62-year-old man realized his useless gift could save lives after all. By the middle of the 4th month, a woman named Kara arrived too, her gift able to soften stone into something as workable as wet clay. Alone she dug more irrigation trench in a single day than 2 grown men could manage in a week. With iron shovels, watching all 4 of them work the land together, he finally understood something that no noble family in this kingdom had ever bothered to notice. The gray gifts weren't broken pieces of nothing. They were fragments of one single, much larger machine, and nobody had ever put the fragments back together. Calculation gave him data. Purity gave him clean water. Soft hands gave him infrastructure. Healing kept everyone standing. Farming tied it all into one living cycle. Alone, each gift looked like a joke. Together, under one roof, they looked like something the crown had never wanted anyone to build. He didn't understand yet exactly what that something was, but he could feel its shape starting to form beneath his hands. One evening he asked Tyron to count something strange. Not grain, not roots, but every living seed lying dormant in the ground within a kilometer of the hut. The boy's eyes went blank for nearly a full minute this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was shaking. 412,000 seeds lay sleeping in dead earth all around them, waiting for someone who finally knew how to wake them up. He looked at Mayra, at Tyron, at Ren and Kara standing quiet behind him, and then east, toward the red scar burning on the horizon. They were going to need a great deal more compost than 4 people could ever make alone. In the 5th month he began waking the dormant seeds, not all at once, but in strips 20 meters wide, 1 strip every single day. He would kneel at the edge of dead soil, press both palms flat into the dust, and let the seal on his hand burn white hot. Mayra knelt beside him with a hand on his wrist, feeding him warmth through her own gift so the effort wouldn't kill him where he knelt. Kara softened the ground ahead of him. Ren followed with clean water. Tyron walked the strip counting every single sprout as it broke the surface. By the end of each day he could barely stand upright, but by the next morning the strip he touched had turned green overnight. Ancient wild grasses no living person had ever seen rose from the ash, like soldiers climbing out of a trench, bent and ragged, but breathing. He wasn't planning anymore. He was resurrecting an entire ecosystem that the crown had buried under 60 years of ash and silence. By the end of the 5th month, to full acres of wild, tangled green stood where nothing had grown in 3 generations. Word had not yet reached the capital, but it had already reached the wasteland itself, and something out there had begun watching. Half a kilometer north of the hut, past a low rocky ridge, Mayra found something that made her come running back with her face pale. An ancient tree stood there, 3 arm spans wide at the trunk, its crown almost bare except for 24 stubborn living leaves. He placed his palm against the bark, and the mark on his hand flared so bright, he had to squint against his own gift. Roots plunging 12 meters down, spreading 100 meters wide in every direction. A vascular system more complex than anything he had touched before. 200 years old, at minimum, and standing, he realized with a chill. 1 single spark away from something no farmer should ever attempt. He sat with it for 3 days before he let himself decide. Because waking a mind was not something you could ever take back. On the 4th morning he placed both palms on the trunk, and gave it something he hadn't given the wheat or the blackthorn. Not time, not growth, just warmth, past hand to bark to root and back again. Like a promise offered with no conditions attached. The growths on the trunk shifted, slow and heavy, like someone surfacing from a very long sleep at the bottom of the sea. 2 of them opened. Beneath the bark lay smooth, moist, green tissue, and it blinked at him like something with eyes finally does. He was standing in front of a 200-year-old tree, and the tree was looking directly back at him. The branches stirred with no wind to move them. Leaves turned toward him like small green palms reaching for warmth. Then the tree spoke, not with a voice, but with a slow creak of bark and a whisper of leaves shaping words no one alive had heard in decades. It asked him one question. Why did you wake me, gardener? He didn't have a clean answer. He said the truth instead, that it had stood on the edge of waking for 2 centuries, and walking past it felt wrong. The tree was silent for a long time, its ancient eyes moving slowly from his face to the gray mark glowing on his palm. Then one heavy branch lowered itself and rested against his shoulder, gentle as an old man's hand settling on his grandson's head. He named it Brahm, not because the name fit perfectly, but because a name was somewhere every new thing had to start. Mara visited the tree the next morning and pressed her palm against the bark, beside his growth-like eyes, and Brahm shuddered down every branch. She told him afterward that in for years on the front, her gift had only ever mended men so they could go back and die again. Touching Brahm for the first time, her hands weren't repairing damage. They were simply giving life, and she stood there quietly crying about it. From that day she visited him every morning for 10 minutes, and her steady touch anchored his newborn mind like a hand holding down a kite in wind. New leaves crept along his driest branches. His voice grew from single words into whole sentences within a matter of weeks. He told them he could sense the border to the east, where the earth wasn't merely dead, it was sick, and something old lay buried beneath the sickness. None of them understood yet how right he was. He did not know it yet, but the thing sleeping under the wasteland had already felt the moment Brahm opened his eyes. By the end of the 3rd month, the farm had grown to half an acre, green enough now to be seen from the road an hour's ride away. On a quiet night, Brahm told them someone had been sitting in the western brush for 3 straight nights, small, silent, never making a sound. He went out and searched twice and found no one at all, because the person hiding there was better at not being found than anyone he'd ever met. On the 3rd night he simply sat at the edge of the field and spoke into the dark, saying he knew someone was there, and that there was food if she wanted it. A figure stepped out of the office rug's thick green cover, small, sharp-eyed, 19 years old, moving so quietly he hadn't heard a single footstep. She held out her palm, a dark blue mark glowed there, not gray. Silent step. A battle gift built for one purpose only. Her name was Soyeon-ha, and she said it flatly, the way a soldier reads out a number from a list. Then, just as flatly, she told him the Southern clan had sent her here to kill him. He didn't move. She kept talking, saying she'd watched him for 3 days. And every day she'd found one more reason not to finish the job. She'd seen an old man purify water with bare hands, a boy laughing when his numbers matched a harvest, a tree stroking a woman's back with one careful branch. She said she wanted bread, if there was any to spare. And that was the first thing she'd asked anyone for in longer than she could remember. He brought her bread and water, and let her eat in silence, because she wasn't used to eating with someone else close enough to hear her chew. When she finished, she told him her whole life had been valued for exactly one thing: how quietly she could end someone else's. He asked if she wanted to stay. She said she had no choice, since returning empty-handed meant the clan would kill her instead. He shook his head and told her that wasn't an answer to the question he'd actually asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said yes, she wanted to stay, because it was quiet here in a way that had nothing to do with killing. In the morning he gave her a job that had nothing to do with knives. Lie down at the eastern edge of the field and listen. Her gift silenced everything around her, which meant it let her hear what the rest of the world usually drowned out. Lying in the dust, her face changed after only a minute. She said she could hear something to the east, a low, heavy rumble, breathing beneath the ground, and footsteps to the northwest, many of them, metal on metal, horses and armored men, to days out, maybe 3, and closing. He did not know it yet, but somewhere north of them, a report about a green field and a dead wasteland had already reached the wrong desk. On the 3rd day, dust rose on the horizon, but it wasn't an army. Just one rider in a single wagon, moving slow. A young garrison officer stopped his horse at the edge of the wheat and simply stared, unable to reconcile the report in his hand with the field in front of him. He gave his name as Lieutenant Vic Tallow, and said he'd come to investigate an authorized agricultural activity on Plot 47. Daniel handed over his travel papers without hesitation. Corrective farming, indefinite term. He'd been ordered to farm. He was farming. Nothing about that was unauthorized. Tallow walked the field in silence, past the wheat, the beans, the compost, the clean water running in narrow ditches, and clearly didn't know what to make of any of it. He asked how much grain the farm could spare for the garrison each month, and Daniel offered to sacks now, 10 within half a year, if they were simply left alone. Tallow thought about it for a long moment, then agreed, promising tools in exchange. Not out of kindness, but because a fed garrison served the crown better than a dead farm. He rode off, and the cart driver loaded to sacks of dark, bitter grain. The first harvest to leave this land in 3 generations. Soyen climbed down from the roof where she'd been sitting the entire time with a knife, just in case negotiations went badly. That night they ate hot porridge together by the fire, and Daniel said quietly that they were on the map now, and the capital would hear of it eventually. Brahm, listening from behind the wall, made a slow, creaking sound none of them had heard from him before. He was laughing. The tools arrived a week later exactly as promised: shovels, a pickaxe, buckets, and real seeds instead of government leftovers. He kept a growing log scratched into the wall with a stick. Dates, plantings, harvest. Every observation Tyron or Soyen or Brahm brought back to him. 2 weeks later he began a new project: grafting flax, healing pollen, and hut lichen into something that had never existed before, a plant that could see. It took 2 exhausting days, and Mayer sat beside him through the worst of it, her hand on his wrist steadying the process from the inside out. By morning a slender stem had pushed through a crack in the stone wall, a bud opening at its tip to reveal something shaped almost exactly like a lens. He called them scout flowers, and within a week he'd grown a dozen of them. Watching eyes scattered across the whole farm, feeding him a view through every root they touched. Soyen said it was better than any human sentry, since a flower never blinked and never got distracted watching the horizon for something that wasn't there. Then, one afternoon, the ground beneath his feet trembled 3 times, gently and deliberately. A signal Brahm had invented entirely on his own. Come. He knelt and pressed both palms against the roots at the base of the trunk, not the bark. The roots themselves, and the world around him fell away. He saw Brahm's entire root network first, 100 meters wide. Thousands of threads woven together like a single breathing organism. Then, deeper, something else, 30 meters down, 50, 100. A second network, ancient, enormous, and either dead or close enough to dead that it made no difference. Roots as thick as tree trunks stretching for kilometers in every direction he could sense. Older than anything Brahm could remember, older than the rift itself. He pulled his hands back and sat frozen in the dirt for a long time before Mayer found him and asked what had happened. He told her there was something beneath all of them, something the wasteland itself had once been built around, and that it wasn't entirely gone. That evening he asked Tyron to measure it, and the boy's eyes went blank for 40 long seconds before he sat down hard on the ground. The number was too large for his gift to fully capture, but at an absolute minimum. 3,000 kilometers of root tissue lay beneath their feet. Soyen said that explained the low rumble she'd been hearing from the east for weeks. It wasn't the rift breathing. It was this. He stood and looked east at the smoldering red line and said quietly that the rift and the wasteland were 2 sides of the exact same wound. He did not know it yet, but the truth behind that wound had been buried in a royal archive for 300 years, waiting for the right person to read it. The 7th month brought people, not one at a time anymore, but in small groups following rumors of grain that grew where nothing should. 3 starving peasants arrived first, offering dried fish and canvas for grain, and he gave them 3 sacks for free, on one condition: that one of them learn to farm properly and carry it home. Word spread faster than he expected. By the end of the month more than 30 people had passed through, some for grain, some just to see if the rumor was even real. At the start of the 8th month, a woman rode in alone on a fine horse, had pulled low, no guards, no escort, and Soyen spotted her a full kilometer out. She gave her name as Eileen Veltrin Kirsta, an inspector from the Crown's Land Resources Office, and Daniel heard the surname and went very still. Veltrin, the royal house itself. She admitted, almost casually, that she was 8th in line to something she preferred not to think about too closely. She walked the farm with a notebook she never actually wrote in, because her gift remembered every word she'd ever read without needing paper at all. She stood in front of Brahm and didn't move, and Brahm told her she smelled of ink and old paper, like the ones who used to come here long before the rift. She took off her glasses, wiped them with a shaking hand, and told Daniel that certain archives contained records she was never supposed to have read. Interrogations. Priest. A decision made 300 years ago that one person should never be allowed to speak to the earth alone. She told him the crown had deliberately shattered a single, powerful gift into small, harmless fragments, so that no one person could ever hold that kind of power again. Farming, calculation, purity, soft hands, every gray gift in the kingdom, she said, was a broken piece of one original whole. Daniel felt something heavy settle into place inside him, a suspicion he'd carried for months finally standing on solid ground. She said her orders were to file a report recommending the farm's immediate closure, and that she wasn't going to write it. He asked her why not, and she said that in 22 years of life, No one had ever once asked her what she actually thought. She said she'd stay, not as an inspector anymore, but as a traitor to a crown built on a 300-year-old lie. He told her she didn't need to call herself a traitor. She could simply say the audit was taking longer than expected. A very thorough audit. It was, by her own admission, the worst cover story she'd ever heard in her life. And she stayed anyway. Fall brought more hands to farmers who chose to stay and learn rather than travel back and forth. A young man who could steer the wind, perfect for drying grain, and a blacksmith's daughter named Hannah Redding, 17, so to her elbows, who had walked 5 days on a rumor that this farm traded tools for food. Her gift was called the cold hammer. Metal bending like wax under her bare hands with no forge and no fire required at all. He didn't want her knives or her horseshoes. He asked instead for a shovel with a blade thin enough to slide between roots, without cutting a single one. She'd spent her whole life forging things built for war. This was the first request anyone had ever made for something built to help the ground survive. She worked a day straight and handed him the finest tool he'd seen in either life he'd lived, a shovel that respected the roots it moved past. By the end of the 9th month, 12 people called the farm home, and Daniel finally gave the place a name, Green Furrow. Every evening after that, Eileen sat by the fire with Brahm, reading him fragments of 300-year-old records while he corrected the parts the old priest had gotten wrong. Together they pieced the truth into a single shape, slowly, night after night, like assembling a body from bones no one wanted anyone to find. The first root wasn't simply a plant, it was a connection, a living network binding every tree and blade of grass across the entire kingdom into one shared mind. Through it, the old world had shared water, nutrients, and warning, the way a single body shares blood between organs that never see each other directly. 300 years ago, the crown decided that kind of unity was too dangerous for any one person to ever command. So they did two things at once. They shattered the single great gift into harmless fragments, and they drove something into the earth to kill the network outright. Eileen couldn't find in any record what exactly had been driven into the ground, only that the result had been total, and the silence had lasted ever since. The trees and grasses kept growing after that, but alone now, disconnected, weaker, cut off from a network that had once kept the whole land alive together. 240 years after the root was murdered, the earth finally cracked open exactly where the wound had struck deepest, and the rift was born. He said it out loud by the fire that night, and every single person listening went completely silent. The crown had killed the root. The earth had sickened for 2 centuries in silence. Then the wound finally split wide open and started bleeding monsters. For 60 years the kingdom had fought a war against the creatures crawling out of that wound, never once realizing they were fighting their own dying land. Mayer said quietly that no war built on swords could ever win against something like that. Daniel looked east at the smoldering red line and said he needed to go there, not with an army, with roots. He did not know it yet, but 100 armored knights were already riding toward Green Furrow with orders that had nothing to do with conversation. Winter arrived in the 10th month, dry and biting, ash riding the eastern winds straight into everything they'd built. The blackthorn weed held its ground under its waxy shell, but the beans, never modified for cold, died in the first hard frost. Then word reached them through the scout flowers that the village across the river was starving, their old-fashioned crops wiped out by the same frost. Daniel loaded half the farm's grain reserve onto a sled and dragged it across to days of frozen wasteland completely alone, refusing every offer of company. The village that greeted him wasn't grateful. An old man with a club called the grain cursed. Poison, the gift of an outcast not fit to feed on his people. Daniel said nothing. He simply built a fire, baked the first loaf right there on a flat stone, and handed it to the nearest hungry child. The boy took one bite and started crying, not from grief, but because the bread in his hands was actually warm. By morning the whole village sat around his sled eating in silence, and the old man with the club admitted quietly that they'd been wrong about him. He left 3 sacks of grain, a sack of seeds, and a promise to send someone in spring to teach them how to make the land feed itself again. When he returned to Green Furrow 2 days later, a letter was waiting for him from Lieutenant Tallow, and it wasn't good news. The capital had noticed. An inspector sent to investigate the farm had vanished without filing a single report, and suspicion was rising fast. Tallow had delayed the follow-up as long as he possibly could, but soon the crown would send someone else, and this time it wouldn't be a garrison officer. It would be the Order of the Steel Carnation, the crown's finest knights, sent not to talk, but to take inventory of a resource. Brahm told him that night he could already sense something heavy, an iron moving slowly toward them. From the northwest, Daniel could have run. He could have taken everyone south and started over somewhere the crown would never think to look. But Brahm couldn't run. Neither could the 6 young trees he'd since awakened, each one rooted to this exact patch of earth by choice, not by chains. He placed his palm on Brahm's trunk and said he wasn't going anywhere. Brahm answered slowly that roots don't run, roots hold. They arrived at the end of the 11th month, 100 armored knights on black horses, lances leveled, a carnation stamped on every breastplate. Daniel had spent 2 weeks preparing, not for battle, but for exactly this. Growing a thorn hedge around the entire perimeter that no blade could quickly cut through. Commander Reinhard Steele Hawthorne rode at the front, 42 years old, 30 years on the front line, a man who had buried 2 regiments and last year, his own son. He said he'd come under Crown orders to seize any resource capable of aiding the war effort, walking trees included, whether Daniel agreed to it or not. Daniel refused. He said the trees weren't his to give away, because they weren't property at all. They were people who happened to have roots. Steele Hawthorne raised one hand, and 100 spears dropped level, aimed straight at the gates of everything Daniel had spent a year building from nothing. Then Brahm walked forward, 3 heavy steps that shook the ground beneath 100 trembling horses, and lowered his crown to the commander's eye level. His voice rolled out across the entire formation, loud enough for the last knight in the last row to hear every single word clearly. "We are not weapons," Brahm said. "We are neighbors. If you want us, ask us yourselves." 100 knights who had fought monsters for 30 years, without ever once retreating, stood frozen before a tree that had just introduced itself politely. Steele Hawthorne slowly raised his hand again, and one by one, every spear in the formation lifted skyward, not to attack, but to salute something none of them had a name for. He turned his horse without another word, said only that this was not the end, and led his knights back across the gray plain into the dust. Daniel's legs finally gave out once the dust settled, and he sat down hard in the dirt with Mayra beside him, her palm warm against his shoulder. Brahm made his way back to his hill slowly, 3 steps costing him more strength than 200 years of standing still ever had. That night, by the fire, Daniel told everyone that Steele Hawthorne would be back, and next time it wouldn't be spears, it would be politics, orders, maybe a siege. They had a winter and a spring to prepare, he said. Enough time to make Green Furrow too costly to break and valuable to ignore. More land, more people, more trees, more ties to the villages around them, and somehow, a way to deal with what lay beneath their feet. If the rift in the wasteland really were one single wound, he said, then it needed healing with roots, not steel. By the end of winter, the furrow had grown to 12 acres, 30 people, 14 sentient trees, a bakery, a school, an infirmary, and a working blacksmith's forge. Every morning Tyron counted dormant seeds along the dead edge of the plot, and the numbers kept climbing higher than anyone could believe. Not for 100,000 anymore. Millions. Spreading denser the closer the count crept toward the rift, as if the dying land had thrown everything it had left into the ground before it went silent. Eileen and Brahm kept working through the archives every evening, filling in the last blank spaces of a 300-year-old crime with slow, patient certainty. Daniel created 3 new hybrids that winter. A sanitary vine that pulled poison out of ash-soaked soil, an anchor grass built to grip bare rock, a listening moss for Soyen's gift. He said one night that he needed to go east, to the rift itself, not with an army, but with a bag of seeds and whoever was willing to walk with him. Mare climbed to the roof where he stood and told him flatly that she was coming too, and that she wasn't asking his permission. She said she'd spent for years patching soldiers up just to send them back to die, and now she'd go where something finally needed to be born instead. The expedition left on the 3rd day of spring. Not an army, a green column. Daniel, Mayra, Soyen, Eileen, Hannah, Tyron, and Brahm, walking east at 3 kilometers a day. 6 young trees stayed behind to guard the furrow alongside Ren, Kara, Mark, and every farmer who now called the green patch home. Daniel sowed off his rug seeds every 100 meters along the way, a green trail behind them and a living telegraph line back to the farm through the roots. On the 2nd day, the ash grew thick enough to coat their lungs, and Daniel wove filter scarves from moss thin enough to breathe through, but tight enough to keep the ash out. On the 3rd day, Tyron stopped mid-step, went pale, and said something was moving beneath the ground all around them, fast, small, and endless. Daniel dug down and found them, gray centipedes flowing underground by the thousands, blind and driven, fleeing the rift in a constant, mindless river. He picked one up, read it through his gift, and understood instantly what 60 years of soldiers had never once realized about the creatures they'd been killing. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a fragment of dead root torn loose from the first network, twitching with no consciousness left inside it whatsoever. Not an enemy. a convulsion. Dead pieces of an ancient body still crawling because the body itself hadn't yet learned how to stop. Eileen went pale when he told her. The Order of the Steel Carnation had spent 60 years hacking apart the very earth they claimed to be protecting. On the 5th day they finally saw it, the rift itself, a crack in the ground 100 meters wide. Its edges scorched black and glowing red from somewhere deep inside. Ash rose from it in a constant column, carried west by the wind. The exact same ash that had been falling on Green Furrow since the day Daniel first arrived. Brahm stopped 300 meters short, saying the heat would kill his bark, but sent his roots stretching forward anyway, a centimeter at a time. Daniel knelt at the very edge and pressed both palms into the scorched black earth, and the mark on his hand flared brighter than it ever had before. He did not know it yet, but 200 meters straight down, something ancient was still breathing, and it had been waiting 300 years for exactly this moment. He saw it 200 meters down, thick as an ancient oak trunk, gnarled and black, trapped in scorched rock like a bone sealed inside an old wound. Around it the ground was sick, poisoned by something driven into the earth 3 centuries ago. Something that kept the root from dying and kept it from healing either. It had spent 300 years in agony, shedding pieces of itself in blind desperation, and every single piece had been called a monster and hunted down. This wasn't a war, he realized, kneeling at the edge of a crack that had been screaming for help since long before he was born in either life. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a midge. He was an agronomist with a gray seal and a sack of seeds, staring down at the largest sick plant in recorded history. He couldn't reach 200 meters down through solid rock. He couldn't remove 3 centuries of poison with his bare hands. But he didn't need to heal the whole root. He needed to give it what it lacked most, a living bridge connecting the surface to the depths, water and light and warmth flowing down where none had reached in generations. He needed roots deep enough, tough enough, and patient enough to grow downward through poison instead of upward toward the sun, which was a request no seed had ever been asked before. He spread 5 kinds of seeds across the ground: blackthorn wheat, oftus rug, anchor grass, the sanitary vine, and the very first blackthorn bush, the one that started everything. 5 sets of instructions pulling in 5 different directions at once, and grafting them together would be the hardest work his gift had ever attempted. Mayra sat beside him with both hands wrapped around his wrist, her gift flowing into him in one steady, unbroken stream to keep him from collapsing outright. Tyron placed a hand on his shoulder and called out numbers as the graft strained and buckled. The left fragment unstable, the right branch dominating, the center losing its shape. Hannah knelt and pressed her palms into the soil beside them, softening the rock beneath the forming seed just enough to give it room to breathe. For fragments of one shattered gift working together as a single organism, gray and gold, counting and forging, doing what none of them could have managed alone. 6 hours later the seed sat finished in his palm, black, heavy as stone, the size of a closed fist. And every one of them was too exhausted to speak. In the morning he carried it to the very edge of the rift alone, refusing Mayraid's insistence on coming with him, since the heat there would kill her instantly. He pressed the seed into a crack in the scorched rock and gave it everything he had left. Not warmth this time, but himself. The memory of Oregon's green fields, the smell of bread, Mayraid's hand on his forehead as he fell asleep, Brahm's slow, creaking laugh, Tyron smiling over a number that finally matched everything he loved in either world, poured straight into a single black seed balanced on the edge of a wound that had been open for 300 years. The seed cracked, a root as thick as his finger pushed down into the stone, 1 meter at a time, drilling through heat that should have killed it instantly. 10 meters, 50, 150. Blood ran from his nose. The touch symbiosis was draining his life straight out through his own hands. At 200 meters, the young root touched the old one, and Daniel felt it like a jolt of raw electricity running straight up his arm. Ancient, enormous, barely alive, and so hungry that the moment contact was made, it clung to the young root like a drowning man finally given something to hold. The first connection in 300 years, surface and depth, young and ancient, living and half-living, reaching for each other across a poisoned grave. Daniel collapsed face down at the edge of the rift, blood running from his nose and ears. And somewhere very far below, he heard something breathe deeply for the first time in centuries. He woke 2 days later with Mayraid's hands still glowing gold against his chest, and she told him flatly to be quiet before he could even try to argue. Brahm's roots had reached the rift's edge in those same 2 days, faster than he'd ever moved in 2 centuries of standing perfectly still. The first root was drinking, Brahm said, water and light pouring down the new bridge like a starving man finally handed bread. After 3 days without food, Tyron pressed his ear to the ground and counted pulses. 12 a minute that morning, 14 by evening. It was waking up, and it was speeding up. On the third day, Soin appeared out of nowhere and said only 2 words. They're coming. Not 100 knights this time, 300 horsemen, 50 wagons, and siege engines. Moving fast, and this time Steel Hawthorn wasn't coming to talk. Daniel tried to stand and swayed instantly. Mare caught him and said they needed to get back to the furrow before the knights ever arrived there first. Brahm said he couldn't come. His roots had grown deep into the rift itself, fused permanently into the bridge holding the whole connection together. Cutting his roots free would kill the bridge. Killing the bridge meant severing the only living path down to the first root forever. He said he'd stay at the rift for the rest of his life if it came to that, because after 200 years of waiting in the wasteland, he finally understood why. Daniel pressed his palm to the trunk one last time, unable to speak, and Brahm lowered a branch onto his shoulder and told him simply, "Go, gardener, grow." They moved fast without him, Daniel stumbling. Mayraid's gift feeding him strength through his own skin the entire way back across the Great Plain. Soin walked ahead listening the whole route, confirming that Steel Hawthorn's column was heading straight for the furrow, not chasing them at all. They reached Green Furrow a full day ahead of the knights, and Daniel gathered everyone by the gate to say the words as plainly as he could. 300 knights, siege engines, tomorrow. No one ran. Hannah raised her hammer and said she wasn't going anywhere. Ren said the same. Kara pressed her hands to the wall and began building it thicker. Eileen took off her glasses, folded them into her pocket, and said she would ride out to meet the column alone, before they ever reached the gate. She was 8th in line to the throne, but a princess of the royal house nonetheless, and that title still meant something even to knights under crown orders. Daniel asked what that would buy them. She looked at him over glasses she'd already put away, a habit that never quite left her, and said he'd figure it out. He was the agronomist. She took Talow's borrowed horse and rode northwest alone, disappearing into the gray until even Soin lost sight of her against the horizon. Daniel knelt and pressed his palm flat against the earth, and through the office rug trail stretching back toward the rift, he sent a message the only way he knew how. Warmth, a promise. The depths answered slowly, the way a sleeper sighs before finally turning toward the light, and somewhere far below, the first root began pushing upward on its own for the very first time. He did not know it yet, but by morning the ground itself would answer for him, in a way no army, no crown, and no order of steel had ever anticipated. Morning came gray as always, but the earth itself was humming, close and steady now, like a heartbeat rising up through the ground beneath every single footstep. Cracks split open in the dead soil beyond the fields, and thin green threads pushed through them. Ancient and gnarled, streaked with veins of pale gold. Tyron stood at the field's edge and counted for a long time before turning around, saying the roots were surfacing within a 4-kilometer radius, all at once, everywhere. Soin appeared on the wall and reported that Steel Hawthorn's column had stopped 5 kilometers out, and that Eileen had intercepted them the evening before. She'd spoken with the commander for 3 hours, then 3 more, laying out everything. The shattered gift, the murdered root, 60 years of war fought against their own dying land. Steel Hawthorn hadn't interrupted her once in 6 hours, which for a man who'd spent 30 years giving orders, said more than any argument ever could. By morning the column moved again, slower this time, without the siege engines, which had been left behind on the road entirely. 300 knights arrived at noon and lined up before the gate exactly as before, but this time not a single lance was lowered to attack. Eileen rode in beside the commander himself, upright in the saddle, glasses gone, her cloak hanging open in the wind for the first time anyone had seen. She told him everything, she said. At first he hadn't believed a word of it. Then he had. Then he'd gone completely silent for straight hours. Then he'd said one thing only. Show me. Daniel led him not to the fields, not to the trees, but to a single crack in the gray earth where a green thread had pushed its way into daylight. Steel Hawthorn knelt in the dust, 42 years old, 30 years on the front line, and touched the thread with his bare hand for the first time. It was warm, alive, pulsing gently under his fingers, and something in his hard, weathered face shifted, not softening exactly, more like a wall realizing it had been built facing the wrong direction entirely. He said his son had died a year ago on the Eastern Front, hacking at gray centipedes that never stopped coming no matter how many fell. He'd been 19 years old, and he died fighting the earth itself, fighting roots that were only ever crying out for help no one had ever bothered to translate. Steel Hawthorn said this evenly, without a single tremor in his voice, though his hands were shaking so hard he had to press them flat against the ground to steady them. Daniel said nothing at all, because there was nothing in either world he had ever lived that could answer a father learning. His son died for a 300-year-old lie. Steel Hawthorn stood, turned to face his own ranks, and told all 300 knights he was revoking the order, not on the crown's authority, but on his own. He said the crown had lied, that the war they'd fought for 60 years wasn't against the rift at all. It was against their own poisoned, screaming land. The formation stood in absolute silence for 10 long seconds before one young knight dismounted, removed his helmet, and knelt beside the crack to look at the green thread himself. Then a second knight, then a third. Not all 300, but more than half, kneeling in the gray dust in front of a sprout instead of a battlefield. By evening the wasteland around the furrow was crisscrossed with thousands of thin green veins, pushing toward the surface, like dawn breaking slowly across an entire dying continent at once. Not green yet, not truly, but crisscrossed. Thin lines threading across gray ground like veins finally visible beneath skin that had looked dead for 60 years. Brahm sent word back through the root telegraph, 3 slow pulses meaning alive, followed by one long, steady pulse he'd never used before. He said he could feel it everywhere now, not just here, but across the entire eastern wasteland. Every exit point pushing toward daylight at once. Tyron pressed his ear flat to the ground and tried to count, and this time he simply couldn't. There were more exit points than his gift could hold in a single tally. He raised his head with his face wet and said the whole eastern plow, every acre of it, was doing the exact same thing right now. The rift itself still pulsed red at the horizon, but quieter than before. The way a fever finally starts to break after the worst of a long, bad night. Soyen lay on the listening moss and said the sound underground had changed completely. No longer strained and desperate, but slow and even. The breath of something finally allowed to sleep. Not agony, real sleep. The kind that comes after the worst of the pain has finally passed. And healing, real healing, has quietly begun instead. Daniel understood the rift wouldn't close overnight. A wound this old took years, maybe decades, to properly mend, and there was no shortcut through that kind of time. But for the first time in 60 years, not a single gray centipede crawled out of the crack in the earth that day, and that alone was worth everything it had cost him. Steele Hawthorne stood beside him at the edge of the field and looked east at the fading red line. For a long, quiet moment before speaking again, he said the crown would never simply accept this. There would be a war, he said, but not against the rift anymore. Against the throne itself. Daniel nodded slowly. He'd already known that was coming. The moment Eileen first told him what she'd read in those buried archives. He said a war against the throne was work for men who carried swords, and he had a different kind of work waiting for him instead. Steele Hawthorne held out his hand, not the hand of a commander this time, just the hand of a man who'd finally been told the truth about his own son's death. Daniel shook it, a gloved palm meeting a gray-marked one, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to put into words. The commander turned back toward his ranks. Not all 300 would follow him now. He knew that much. But the ones who had knelt in the dirt would. And for the work still ahead of them, he said quietly, that would have to be enough. The column rode north that evening, smaller than it had arrived. Dust rising and slowly settling behind 300 horses turning away from a fight. None of them wanted any more. Daniel watched them go until they disappeared entirely, then walked back through the gate to a farm that had somehow survived a second army. In less than a year, Mare met him at the threshold and pressed her palm to his chest, checking his pulse the way she always did after he'd given too much of himself away again. He told her he was fine. She said she'd decide that for herself, and neither of them argued about it any further. Eileen rode back through the gate and are behind the retreating column, exhausted. Hoarse from 6 hours of talking a hardened commander out of a war. She dismounted, sat by the fire without a word, and let Ren press a mug of warm water into her hands before she finally allowed herself to shake. Daniel sat beside her and asked what she'd actually said to change his mind. After 30 years of following crown orders without ever once questioning them, she said she hadn't argued philosophy or politics at all. She'd simply told him the plain, documented truth, and let a grieving father draw his own conclusion from it. That was the thing about paper memory, she said. It didn't persuade anyone. It only removed the excuse to keep looking away from what was already there. The following week settled into something the farm had never quite had before. A strange, careful peace stretched thin over the certainty that it wouldn't last forever. Tyron kept his morning count of the surfacing roots, and every single day the number climbed higher, spreading further from the rift than anyone had thought possible. Ren purified water for 3 villages now instead of 1, walking the circuit himself twice a week with a bucket that never seemed to run dry. Kara had rebuilt half the original hut into something closer to real settlement. Stone walls thick enough to survive a hard winter and a second visit from Steel. Hannah's forge never went cold, turning out root-safe tools for every new farmer who wandered in from villages that used to call this land cursed. Soyeon still slept on rooftops more often than beds, but she sat half a centimeter closer to the fire every single evening. And Daniel had started keeping count. Mayra trained 2 of the village women in basic herb work, saying quietly that Green Furrow couldn't run on one healer forever, no matter how hard that healer tried. Brahm, still rooted at the rift, sent word every evening through the telegraph line. One long pulse meaning simply that the connection below was holding steady. Eileen wrote late into every night now, not archive fragments anymore, but her own words. The first true sentences she'd ever written that weren't someone else's record. She called it a history of what actually happened here, in case the Crown's official version ever tried to claim something different had taken place instead. Daniel understood exactly why she was writing it down, and he understood, too, that a written history only mattered if there were still people left to read it. Because underneath the quiet, underneath the bread and the compost and the ordinary rhythm of a farm slowly becoming a town, something else was gathering. A commander revoking one order on his own authority was not the same as a crown accepting defeat, and every single person at Green Furrow knew that difference by heart. Letters started arriving through the villages. Secondhand rumors of unrest in garrisons further north. Soldiers asking questions their officers couldn't answer without lying outright. Eileen said her family would notice her absence soon, if they hadn't already, and that a missing princess was the kind of thing a kingdom didn't simply forget about. Daniel asked her, one evening, if she regretted staying. She looked at the fire for a long time before answering that regret required wanting to go back, and she didn't. He told her that was the closest thing to a real answer he'd ever gotten out of an archivist, and she almost smiled at that. The villages under the Furrow's protection sent representatives asking for something no one there had a name for yet, not quite an alliance, not quite a kingdom, something in between. Daniel didn't know what to call it either. He only knew that turning any of them away now would undo everything a single winter of shared bread had built. He did not know it yet, but somewhere in the capital, a name had already been written into a report that no one at Green Furrow would ever be allowed to read. Spring rolled fully into summer, and the green threading the wasteland thickened from thin veins into something that finally looked, from a distance, like actual life returning. Tyrant's counts kept climbing, 6 kilometers of surfacing route, then 10. Then a number so large he simply stopped announcing it and started writing it on the wall instead. Farmers from villages that had once burned crops rather than believe in a cursed man's grain now walked the road to Green Furrow openly in daylight, without shame. Daniel taught crop rotation to anyone who asked, standing in the dirt with a stick, drawing diagrams of roots and nitrogen the way he used to draw them for one frightened boy alone. The word furrow started appearing on other people's tongues too, not as an insult anymore, but as a description of anywhere the dead ground had started breathing again. Soyeon returned from a scouting run one evening with news that wasn't good. Garrison patrols near the northern road had doubled, and none of them were talking to locals anymore. Eileen said that kind of silence from soldiers usually meant orders had come down that weren't meant to be discussed, which in her experience was rarely a peaceful sign. Daniel asked Brahm, through the route line, if he could sense anything else moving beyond the usual rhythm of the healing wasteland around him. The answer came back slower than usual. Yes, something metal gathering far to the north. More of it than before, patient, waiting for a reason instead of an order. He understood what that meant without needing it spelled out further. The Crown wasn't preparing to argue anymore. It was preparing to decide the matter by force. Mayor asked him one night, quietly, if he was afraid. He said he was, and that being afraid had never once stopped him from planting the next row of seeds anyway. Eileen received a letter, unsigned, delivered by a merchant who claimed to know nothing about who'd handed it to him at the crossroads 3 days back. It named her formally, by her full royal title, and stated plainly that her continued absence would be treated, going forward, as an act against the Crown itself. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it directly into the fire without a single word of hesitation, watching the paper curl black at the edges. Daniel asked if that was wise. She said wisdom had stopped mattering the moment she chose truth over her own family's comfortable silence. Months ago at Brahm's roots, Steele Hawthorne sent word to, through a writer Tallow trusted, warning that the capital had begun quietly reassigning loyal officers away from the eastern garrisons entirely. That kind of reshuffling, Eileen explained, usually came right before Crown wanted fewer witnesses standing between an order and whatever that order was about to do. Daniel called everyone together by the fire and laid it out plainly, the way he always did. Something is coming. We don't know exactly what yet, or exactly when. Hannah said she'd keep the forge running day and night if it came to that. Kara said the walls could be thicker within a week if she pushed herself. Rin said clean water mattered more than ever if a siege ever came. And he'd already started storing what he could in every container the farm owned. Tyron said he'd count anything anyone needed counted, and for the first time, no one laughed at how seriously he meant it. Soyeon said she'd be watching the roads, same as always, and that whatever came, it wouldn't reach the gate without her hearing it first. Daniel looked around at every face lit orange by the fire and understood, fully, for the first time, exactly what he'd actually built out here in the ash. Not just a farm, not just a shelter for people the kingdom had thrown away. A reason for a father who'd lost his son to finally ask a different question. And reasons like that, he knew, were the one thing a crown built on 3 centuries of silence could never fully put back in the ground. The 3 villages under the Furrow's protection sent their elders together that summer, asking Daniel plainly what he wanted to call whatever it was they'd all become. He said he didn't need a name for it. A neighbor was a neighbor whether the word for it existed yet or not, and that had always been enough for him. The elders didn't fully understand that answer, but they understood the grain in their storehouses, and that was the kind of proof no title could ever improve on. Eileen began drafting something else that summer, quietly at night. A record of exactly how crop rotation, clean water, and shared labor had turned 3 starving villages self-sufficient in one season. She said if the crown ever tried to erase what happened here, she wanted proof solid enough that even paper memory couldn't be argued away by a royal decree. Mayra and Daniel started taking the evening walk to Brahm's old hill together most nights. Out of habit now more than necessity, just to stand where the tree used to stand. She told him once, without any particular weight in her voice, that she hadn't thought about the front lines in weeks, and that surprised her more than anything else. He told her that was the whole point of everything he'd been trying to build. A place quiet enough that a person could finally stop counting the days since the last disaster. She looked at him for a long moment in the fading light and said that quiet, real quiet, was harder to build than any hybrid seed he'd ever grown. Soyeon's reports from the road grew shorter and more clipped as summer wore on, which everyone had learned by now meant she was seeing things she didn't like. Wagons moving north without cargo, garrisons emptying out toward the capital instead of the front, officers reassigned overnight with no explanation given to the men left behind. Tallow sent one final letter before his own transfer came through, warning that whatever was building in the capital had stopped pretending to be about the rift at all. Eileen read the letter twice and said the wording matched language she remembered from the archives. The exact phrasing the crown had used 300 years ago before the first purge began. Daniel asked her straight out whether that meant history was about to repeat itself. She said history didn't repeat on its own. People repeated it when no one stopped them in time. He decided, that night, that Green Furrow would stop waiting to be attacked and start becoming something rooted, to connected, to alive, to simply be erased by a single decree. He sent Kieran north with 2 farmers to help a 4th village build its own compost system, tying one more thread into a network the crown could no longer easily sever. He sent Hannah south with a wagon of root-safe tools, trading them for nothing but a promise that if the day came, that village would stand with the furrow, not against it. Every new thread he wove wasn't a weapon. It was exactly what Brahm had always said the earth itself was built from: connection. Roots reaching toward other roots. By late summer, 7 villages stood tied to Green Furrow by grain, by water, by taut hands and shared harvests, none of them soldiers, all of them, somehow an army anyway. On a still evening near the end of summer, Soyeon came in from the road at a dead run, which everyone knew by now meant something had finally broken. She said the mobilization order had been signed. Troops were moving south from the capital, not toward the rift, toward every green patch the crown had marked on its maps. Daniel stood very still and felt the ground hum faintly beneath his boots, the way it always did now, steady and alive and utterly unafraid of what was coming. He did not know exactly what the next few weeks would bring, but he knew with total certainty that Green Furrow would not be standing alone when it arrived. Word of the mobilization reached the 7 villages within 2 days, carried faster by fear than any messenger could have managed on his own. Instead of scattering, as the crown likely expected, farmers who had once called Daniel cursed started arriving at the gates, carrying whatever they could lift and carry. Hannah forged through the night without stopping. Ren purified every drop of water the farm's storage could hold. Kara reinforced walls that had already been reinforced twice before. Eileen sat by the fire compiling everything she knew into a single account: dates, names, decrees, in case the truth needed to survive even if nothing else did. Mayer trained a dozen village women in the fastest triage techniques she remembered from for years on the actual front, praying she'd never need to use them here. Soyeon disappeared for 2 full days, scouting the northern road, and came back with numbers that made Tyron go quiet for the first time anyone could remember. Not 300 knights this time, a full column, infantry included. More than the eastern garrisons had fielded in a single formation in over a decade of war. Daniel walked the fields that night alone, pressing his palm to the ground at every turn, feeling the humming network beneath his feet answer him back, steady and unafraid. He thought of Brahm at the rift, still connected, still holding the bridge open to 100 meters down into a wound that was finally, slowly, starting to close. He thought of every hand that had ever picked up a bucket, forged a shovel, counted a root, or purified a cup of water on this exact patch of ground. He understood, standing there in the dark, that this had never really been his farm alone. Not since the 8th day. Not since a fevered woman fell face first into his wheat. It belonged to everyone who had ever chosen to stay, when leaving would have been so much easier. And that ownership, he realized, was the one thing no crown could seize. Steele Hawthorne's final letter arrived the next morning, brief and grim, warning that the column marching south had orders that went well beyond simple inventory this time. He wrote that he could not stop it, but that he would not lead it either, and that whatever men still followed him would stand wherever Daniel chose to stand. Eileen read the letter aloud to everyone gathered by the fire, her voice steady even as her hands trembled around the paper. Daniel looked around the circle of faces: Mayra, Tyron, Ren, Kara, Hannah, Soyen. 30 more he'd come to know by name, and 7 villages waiting behind them. He said the only thing he actually knew how to say with any real certainty: they would not run. They would not surrender the ground. They would grow. Because a wound this old didn't heal by hiding from the next blow. It healed by standing exactly where it was struck, and refusing, this time, to be silenced again. The fire crackled low. The wind carried less ash than it had a year ago. Somewhere beneath them all, the first root pulsed on, steady, patient, and finally awake. And far to the northwest, a column of soldiers under a crown built on 3 centuries of silence marched south toward a green light they still did not understand. Days passed, and the column on the horizon never fully arrived, held back, Eileen guessed, by whatever argument Steele Hawthorne was still fighting somewhere deep inside the capital itself. Whatever war was coming for the throne, it would not be won or lost in a single week. And Daniel understood that some battles simply had to be lived through, not rushed. So the farm kept doing the only thing it had ever truly known how to do. It grew. Tyron's morning counts kept climbing, roots surfacing further east every single day. Closer and closer to the fading red line still glowing faintly on the horizon. Ren's water ran clean through every ditch on the property, and 3 more villages asked, that autumn, whether someone might come teach them the same trick with their own wells. Kara finished the last stretch of thick stone wall around the settlement, not for war exactly, she said, but because good walls made people sleep easier either way. Hannah's forge produced more root-safe shovels that fall than knives, and she told Mayor one evening that she'd stopped missing the sound of a proper anvil months ago. Soyen still watched the roads every day, but her reports grew calmer, week by week, as the distant column seemed to stall somewhere north and simply stop advancing. Eileen's written account grew into something closer to a real book, chapters instead of fragments. The first honest history of Green Furrow written by someone who had actually lived it. Mayra delivered her first baby that autumn, a girl born to one of the original 3 farmers, and Daniel watched her hold the newborn with hands steadier than he'd ever seen them. She told him afterward, quietly, that for years on the front had taught her every way a body could die, and she'd almost forgotten how good it felt to watch one begin instead. The seasons turned again, slow and ordinary, the kind of ordinary that only feels precious to people who once thought they'd never get to have it at all. Brahm sent word from the rift every single evening, one long, steady pulse, and Daniel always answered back the same way, warmth traveling through roots faster than any letter ever could. The tree said, one evening, that he could feel new life pressing up through the soil in places even he had never expected. Roots to reach, grass, wildflowers, small green things with no names yet, breaking through ground that had been gray and silent for 3 full human generations. Before any of this began, Daniel stood at the edge of his field one clear evening and realized he could no longer see where his original 3 acres had ended and the healing wasteland had begun. It had all simply become one continuous stretch of green, threading east toward a wound that was, slowly, finally, learning how to close on its own. He thought of the boy who had woken up cold and frightened in a stranger's body on a swaying cart, certain he'd been sent somewhere to die. That boy hadn't understood yet what he actually was. Not a farmer sent away in disgrace. A gardener standing at the exact center of a world that had simply forgotten how to heal itself. Mare found him standing there, as she often did now, and slipped her hand into his without either of them needing to say a single word about it. The wind carried less ash than it used to. Somewhere behind them, Tyron was laughing at a number that had finally matched. Somewhere further, Hannah's hammer rang against warm iron. The farm hummed with the ordinary noise of a place that had chosen, over and over, to keep living. And that noise, Daniel had come to understand, was its own kind of victory. That night, sitting on the porch of a house that had once been nothing but a crooked stone hut, he told Mayra he wanted to say something out loud, finally, without hedging. He said that whatever happened with the crown, whatever came marching down that northern road eventually, he wasn't afraid of it the way he had been a year ago. Not because the danger was smaller now. It wasn't. 300 soldiers were still 300 soldiers, and a throne with 3 centuries of secrets to protect wasn't going to forgive easily. He said he wasn't afraid because for the first time since waking up in a stranger's body, he wasn't facing any of it alone in an empty field. Mayra didn't answer right away. She just leaned her shoulder against his and let the silence sit there, comfortable. The way silence only gets between people who trust each other completely. Then she said that fear had never really been the thing that scared her most either. Being useless had. And nothing about this place had ever let her be useless again. He placed his palm flat against the porch step, and the mark on his hand answered with a warmth that had nothing urgent about it, just steady, quiet presence. Below them, threading east through kilometers of once dead earth, the first root kept climbing toward the surface at its own unhurried pace, patient the way only something ancient could afford to be. It didn't need him to win a war. It only needed him to keep listening. The way he had from the very first afternoon he knelt in the dust of Plot 47. He realized, sitting there, that this had been the actual answer all along. Buried under every twist and every threat since the day he first opened his eyes on that cart. Not power, not victory. Just the discipline to notice what was dying quietly beneath your own feet. And the patience to give it exactly what it needed to live again. Steele Hawthorne's letters kept arriving through the winter that followed. Careful and guarded. Describing a capital growing more divided by the month, as his own written accounts spread hand to hand. Eileen's book, copied and passed quietly between garrisons and villages alike, did more to slow the crown's hand than any wall Kara had ever built, or any blade Hannah had ever forged. The truth, it turned out, moved slower than an army, but it was far harder to kill once it had taken root in enough different places at once. Daniel understood that the fight for the throne was still coming someday. In some form none of them could fully predict yet, and he'd made his peace with that uncertainty. Because the fight he had already won was the one that mattered most to him, the one fought silently, one dead acre at a time, with nothing but seeds and stubbornness. He had been sent to Plot 47 to disappear quietly and be forgotten. One more gray-marked failure swallowed by an indifferent wasteland. The crown never expected to hear from again. Instead, he had planted a farm that grew into a town, awakened a network the crown had spent 3 centuries trying to bury, and given an entire dying wound a reason to heal. And whatever came next, whatever the crown eventually decided to do about a green light that refused to go out, that part of the story was already written and could never be undone. The wasteland was no longer a wasteland. It hadn't been for a long time now. It was simply, finally, ground doing exactly what ground was always supposed to do: grow. Soyen's place on the farm had never been formally decided, not with words, and that suited her fine, since words had never been the thing she trusted most anyway. She still slept where she pleased, rooftops mostly. Sometimes the crook of Brahm's lowest branch before he'd left for the rift. Always somewhere she could see every angle of the gate at once. Mayor started leaving a plate for her by the hearth every night, regardless of whether she showed up to eat it, and more often than not, by morning, it was empty. No one ever mentioned it out loud. That was its own kind of language on this farm. The plate left out, the empty plate found, a whole conversation with no words spoken at all. One evening she sat close enough to Daniel by the fire that Hannah elbowed Ren and grinned, and Soyen shot her a look sharp enough that Hannah immediately found something else to do. Daniel didn't tease her about it. He learned early that Soyen's silences meant more than most people's sentences, and that pushing too hard on any of them only sent her back to the rooftops. Instead, he simply handed her bread without being asked, the same way he had the very first night she stepped out of the office rug with a knife she never once used. She told him once, quietly, staring at the fire rather than at him, that she still dreamed sometimes about jobs she never finished, faces she was supposed to erase but hadn't. He asked if that bothered her. She said it used to. Now the dreams mostly just made her grateful, in a strange, backward way, for every single morning she woke up somewhere quiet instead. Eileen's evenings with Brahm, before he left for the rift, had built something neither of them had a name for either. an old tree, and a girl raised entirely by paper. She used to read him documents cover to cover from memory, flat and precise. And somewhere, along the way, she'd started adding her own thoughts between the lines, without quite meaning to. Brom told her once that her voice had changed over the months, less like a girl reciting facts, more like a girl actually deciding, sentence by sentence, what she believed to be true. She said no one had ever told her that before, that her voice belonged to her and not just to whatever book she happened to be quoting from at the time. After he left for the rift, she kept the habit anyway, reading her nightly notes aloud to no one in particular, just to hear her own conclusions spoken instead of only written down. Daniel found her doing this once, alone by the fire, and instead of interrupting, he simply sat down across from her and listened until she finished the page. She looked up afterward, a little embarrassed, and he told her it sounded exactly like a history worth reading, which was the first time in her whole life anyone had called her writing that. Ren's days settled into a quiet, steady rhythm that suited a man who had spent 6 to 2 years believing his gift was only good for scrubbing dishes no one cared about. He walked the growing circuit of villages twice a week now, a bucket in each hand, purifying wells that had sat brackish and half-poisoned since before the rift ever opened. Old women who remembered him as nothing but a laundress's husband started greeting him by name again. He told Mayra once that he'd stopped feeling like a man waiting to die out here, and started feeling, for the first time in years, like a man people were actually glad to see coming. Kara's stonework crept steadily outward from the original hut, walls becoming rooms. Rooms becoming a proper settlement with real floors instead of packed dirt underfoot. She softened rocked the way other people needed to, patient and unhurried. And every evening she stood back to look at what she'd built with an expression close to disbelief. She told Daniel once that back home, her gift had been considered fit only for smoothing leather and softening rope. Nothing a person could ever build an actual life from. He told her that a farm needed walls as much as it needed wheat, and that soft hands, it turned out, were exactly what a whole town had been waiting for all along. Hannah's forge became something of a gathering place after dark, sparks catching the eyes of anyone walking past. The ring of metal on metal, a sound the farm had never had before her. She taught to younger boys from the villages how to read the tension in a piece of iron, with their bare hands, though neither of them carried a gift anything like her own. It didn't matter, she told them. Most of forging was patience and listening anyway, gift or no gift, and that much anyone willing to pay attention could learn given enough time. She still kept the first flatbread and handful of berries Daniel had left outside her workspace. That very first week, dried and wrapped in cloth, tucked into a corner no one else ever touched. Tyron grew taller through that year in ways that had nothing to do with his gift, filling out the way boys do when someone finally feeds them regularly and asks their opinion. He kept his wall of numbers meticulously, root counts, seed counts, harvest weights, and had started teaching Daniel's own method to 2 younger children in the villages, who showed the same gray gift he once. He told them what Daniel had told him on his very first day here, that counting wasn't nothing. That counting was simply seeing the world in a language most people never bothered to learn. One of the children cried the way Tyron himself once had, not from grief, but because someone had finally called her useless gift something worth being proud of. The 7 villages tied to Green Furrow began sending their own scout flowers along the roads that connected them. Small green watchposts blinking quietly at crossroads no army could easily approach unseen. Daniel hadn't asked anyone to build this network. It had simply grown that way. One village teaching the next, roots reaching for other roots exactly the way Brom had always said they would. Eileen mapped the whole spreading system in her notebook, watching a defensive shield take shape out of nothing more than shared knowledge and mutual stubbornness. No swords required anywhere in the design. She said, half to herself, that this was probably exactly what the first route had looked like 300 years ago, before anyone decided a single connected world was too dangerous to allow. Daniel thought about the expedition to the rift often that year, the 5 days of walking, the ash thick enough to taste, the gray centipedes flowing underground like a blind, panicked river. He thought about the moment his palm first touched the scorched black earth at the crevice's edge, and felt, 200 meters down, something ancient clinging to life out of pure stubborn refusal to die. He thought about the 6 hours of grafting with Mayraid's hands wrapped around his wrist, Tyron's numbers calling out corrections, Hannah softening rock beneath a seed none of them had ever attempted before. He thought about blood running from his nose and ears at the crevice's edge, and Mayraid's scream somewhere far away, and the sound, faint and enormous, of something finally breathing evenly after 300 years. He didn't tell that story often. It didn't need retelling. Every green thread rising out of the wasteland told it better than his own voice ever could. Day after day, without exception. Winter came again, gentler than the first, the ash thinner, the frost less biting. The first true sign that whatever had been dying beneath their feet was, slowly, finding its way back toward living. Beans survived this time, grafted the season before with a little of the blackthorn's own hardiness folded into the roots. One more small correction learned from a year of careful, patient failure. The village across the river sent grain back to Green Furrow that winter for the first time. Not charity returned, just neighbors doing for neighbors what neighbors had always been meant to do. The old man who had once called Daniel's grain curse sent a jar of preserved fruit, along with the sacks, no note attached, none needed. The gesture saying everything that needed saying on its own. Mayraid's hands had changed over that year, Daniel noticed. Callous now from bucket handles and herb cutting instead of the field surgeries she used to perform under enemy fire. She still healed, every single day, but the wounds she treated now were mostly sunburn and blistered palms. And one memorable incident involving Hannah's forge in a moment of poor timing. She told him once that she measured how far she'd come by how boring her workday had become. And that boring, to her, was the single greatest luxury she had ever known. He asked her one quiet evening whether she ever missed the front, the urgency of it, the certainty of exactly what needed doing every single hour of every single day. She thought about it longer than he expected. Before answering that she missed being needed that badly sometimes, but never the reason people needed her. Here, she said, she was needed in an entirely different way for babies instead of bodies, for scraped knees instead of shattered ones. And she'd take that trade every single time without hesitation. Daniel understood exactly what she meant, because his own gift had once been considered useless too. Right up until someone finally needed a field that could grow instead of a sword that could kill. They didn't talk often about what they were to each other, not directly. Not with the kind of words Eileen might have written into her careful, precise archive of everything that happened here. It showed instead in smaller things, the extra portion set aside without asking, the hand on the shoulder after a long day of grafting. One evening, walking back from the fields together, Mayer simply took his hand without announcing it. The way she'd started doing more and more as the year wore on, and he didn't let go either. Neither of them said anything about it. They didn't need to. The whole farm had already noticed months before either of them had gotten around to admitting it out loud. The gray wasteland around them kept changing too, quietly, month over month. Gray giving way to green in patches too numerous now for even Tyron to keep an exact daily count. Wildflowers Brahm had once described from memory. The ones birds used to eat back when there were still birds here, started pushing up along the old cart road for the very first time in decades. Daniel didn't know yet whether birds would ever return to a land that had gone silent before he was even born in either of his two lives, but he let himself hope for it anyway. He'd learned, over the year, that hope wasn't foolish here the way it might have been on the day he first arrived in a stranger's body on the back of a rattling cart. Hope, on this farm, had a track record. It had grown wheat from ash. It had woken a 200-year-old tree. Hope, he'd come to understand, wasn't the opposite of hard work. It was simply what hard work looked like from far enough away to see the whole shape of what it was building. He thought sometimes about the empty highway in Oregon, the jazz on the radio, the life he lived before the darkness took him and dropped him into a boy named Dan Kieran's failing body. He didn't know how or why it had happened, and after a year here, he mostly stopped asking. Some questions he learned from the earth itself didn't need answers to be worth living past. What mattered was what grew in the space where the question used to sit, and in his case, that space had filled up with more life than he'd ever imagined one gray gift could hold. Steele Hawthorne's letters, when they came, grew longer over the months, less official, more like the writing of a man slowly working out what he actually believed, instead of what he'd always been ordered to. He wrote once about a young knight in his ranks the same age his son would have been, who had asked to be reassigned east toward the villages instead of north. Steele Hawthorne had granted the request without hesitation, and told Daniel in the same letter that he'd started doing that more often lately. He wrote that the capital still hadn't moved the column any further south, and that every week it sat still felt, to him, like a small, quiet victory neither side would ever officially claim. Eileen read every letter twice, once for the words, once for what she called the spaces between them, the hesitations and half-finished thoughts a trained archivist could spot the way. Tyron spotted numbers. She told Daniel that Steele Hawthorne was a man caught between two loyalties now, the crown that made him and the truth that had finally been allowed to reach him. Daniel didn't need her to explain that twice. Change, he learned, rarely arrived all at once in this world or the one he'd left behind. The second spring came gentler than the first had any right to be. Warm rain instead of ash-flecked cold. Daniel walked from field to field that spring, teaching what he'd taught 100 times already. Rotation, compost, the patient logic of letting the ground rest between one crop and the next. He no longer needed to explain why the soil was alive. Tyron, taller now, walked beside him at these teaching sessions, translating Daniel's instructions into exact numbers the way he always had: roots per stalk, nodules per square meter. Ren traveled further that spring than he ever had before, purifying wells in villages that had never even heard of Green Furrow a year earlier, carrying nothing but a bucket and 62 years of quiet. Kara finished the last section of the settlement's outer wall that spring, and stood back to look at what had once been a crooked, half-rotten hut, now surrounded by something that genuinely resembled a town. Hannah forged a bell for the new schoolhouse Kara had built, the first bell the wasteland had heard ring in 6 decades. Soyen still watched the roads, though her reports had softened over the months into something almost gentle. Quiet from the north, quiet from the west, quiet from the south. Eileen finished the first full draft of her book that spring and read the final chapter aloud. By the fire, her own voice steady now, no longer borrowing certainty from documents that weren't her own. Mayra cried at the ending, not from sadness this time, but because hearing the whole story laid out in order made her realize just how far all of them had actually traveled together. Daniel sat listening with his hand resting flat against the warm earth beneath the porch step, feeling the whole network come quietly under his palm, patient, alive. He thought about the mark on his own hand, still glowing faintly gray after everything, the seal that had once been called Shameful. He thought that if his old life's father, back in Oregon, could somehow see what that shameful little gray sprout had actually grown into, he wouldn't have understood a single word of it. Some things, he decided, were never meant to be understood from a distance. Word came that summer, secondhand through Steele Hawthorne's careful letters, that Eileen's book had reached hands inside the capital itself, copied by people who had never once set foot in the wasteland. A junior clerk in the Land Resources Office, the very office that had first sent Eileen out to investigate the farm, had apparently read 3 chapters before quietly resigning his post without explanation. Steele Hawthorne wrote that small resignations like that one were happening more often now. Quiet erosions no single decree could fully stop. Truth spreading the same patient way roots spread underground. Eileen read that particular letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where she kept every letter that had ever mattered to her, which by that point was most of them. Daniel asked her once whether she thought the Crown would ever be forced to answer publicly for what had been buried 300 years ago. She said the important thing wasn't the timeline. It was that the ground itself was already answering, one green thread at a time, whether the throne ever admitted anything or not. That summer, Daniel and Mayra walked together to the site of the old blackthorn bush, the very first plant he'd ever touched with his gift in this world. It had grown taller over the year, thicker, its 3 living branches out of 10 from that first desperate morning, now nearly indistinguishable from a full, healthy crown of green. He placed his palm against its trunk the way he had on his very first day here, and felt faintly. Mayra stood beside him and said that this particular bush, more than anything else on the whole farm, was the true beginning of everything that had happened since, before Brahm, before the villages. He agreed, quietly, without needing another word to explain it. That, he told her, was the whole lesson buried inside everything he'd ever learned about growing things. In either world he'd lived in, survival wasn't about strength. It was about refusing to stop reaching. The seasons kept turning after that, the way seasons always do, indifferent to armies and decrees and even to the slow, patient healing of a 300-year-old wound in the ground. Green Furrow grew larger with every one of them, not through conquest, not through force, but through the same quiet method that had built it from the very first day. One seed, one hand. The villages tied to it grew too, self-sufficient now in ways none of them had ever imagined possible. When Daniel first offered 3 free sacks of grain to strangers who called his gift a curse, Steele Hawthorne visited once more that year, alone this time, no armor, no formation behind him, just a tired man in plain clothes who wanted to see, with his own eyes. He stood at the edge of the wheat field for a long time before speaking, the same way he had the very first time he'd arrived here with 100 lances aimed at the gate. He said the wasteland looked nothing like the reports he used to file, back when reports were the only language the Crown had ever taught him to speak in. Daniel told him it looked like exactly what it had always wanted to be, if anyone had ever bothered to ask it, instead of simply deciding. From a palace 300 years ago. Steele Hawthorne didn't answer that directly. It had never stopped being real. Not for a single day since a boy from another world knelt in the exact same dirt, and felt water pulsing 6 meters beneath his palm. That evening, before Steel Hawthorne rode back north. Daniel walked him to the edge of the settlement and asked, plainly, whether he regretted the order he'd revoked a year and a half ago now. The commander was quiet for a long moment, looking east toward a red line that had faded, month by month, into something closer to a dull. He said the only thing he regretted was not asking the question 3 decades sooner, before his son ever picked up a sword to fight an enemy that had never actually been the enemy yet. Daniel didn't have an answer for that kind of grief, not one that would have meant anything spoken aloud. So he simply stood beside him in silence until the commander was ready to leave. Steel Hawthorne mounted his horse, looked back once at the green fields behind the gate, and said only that he'd keep riding, keep watching. Then he rode north, alone, into a dust that no longer carried nearly as much ash as it used to. And Daniel watched him go until the horse and rider disappeared into the fading light. He walked back through the gate feeling the same steady hum beneath his boots that had greeted him every evening for well over a year now, patient, alive. Inside, the settlement had settled into its evening rhythm, the bell from the schoolhouse silent now until morning, smoke rising thin and gray from a dozen chimneys that hadn't existed when he first arrived. Children ran between the buildings, chasing something Tyron had counted for them earlier, a game that had grown out of his gift the way so many small. Hannah's forge glowed orange against the dark. Ring carried his last bucket of the evening toward the schoolhouse cistern. Kara sat on a finished wall, resting her hands, finally, after a full day of building. Eileen sat by the fire with her book open on her lap, not reading tonight, just holding it. The way a person holds something they made themselves and are still slightly amazed actually exist. Soyen sat closer to the flames than she used to. Close enough now that no one bothered measuring the distance anymore, because the distance had simply stopped being something worth measuring at all. Daniel found Mayer exactly where he expected to, on the porch, watching the last of the daylight fade behind fields that used to be nothing but gray, endless, forgotten ash. He sat down beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything, letting the ordinary evening noise of the farm settle around them the way it always did. Bell gone quiet, he thought, sitting there, about everything the mark on his own palm had come to mean since the day he first opened his eyes on a swaying cart and thought his life, in every sense. It hadn't been over. It had barely started. It had only ever needed him to notice what was quietly dying, and to be patient enough, stubborn enough to give it exactly what it needed to come back to life on its own. That, more than any battle won or any commander convinced, felt like the truest thing he'd learned in either of the two lives he'd now lived, back to back. The earth remembers everything it's ever lost, and it forgives almost anything. If someone is finally willing to kneel down, listen closely, and start again. He thought about the very first night in this world, the fear of it, the strangeness of waking inside a body that wasn't his own. He remembered thinking, in that first hour, that he'd been handed the worst possible gift in the worst possible place, a farming talent no one wanted. He hadn't understood yet that the gift and the land were never actually separate problems. They were the same problem, waiting for exactly one person patient enough to treat them as a single, solvable question. Mayer shifted beside him on the porch, resting her head against his shoulder, and told him quietly that she still remembered the exact moment she first saw the wheat ring around the blackthorn bush. She said she'd thought, falling into the field that day, that she was hallucinating from fever, because nothing that green was supposed to exist anywhere within 3 days' walk of where she'd collapsed. He told her he remembered the moment just as clearly, the sight of a stranger falling face first into his first real harvest, and how certain he'd been. In that instant, it had ended, and neither of them, sitting together on a porch a year and a half later, would have traded that ending for anything the crown could have offered in exchange. Somewhere behind them, Tyron's voice carried across the yard, counting something out loud for one of the village children, delighted as always. Somewhere further off, Hannah's hammer rang twice more against cooling iron before the forge finally went quiet for the night, the last sound of the working day settling into the growing hush of evening. The wind moved gently across the fields, carrying the smell of turned soil and drying herbs instead of ash and bitterness. He thought about Brahm, standing alone at the rift today's journey east, roots buried 200 meters down into a wound that had finally, slowly, stopped screaming after 3 centuries of silent agony. He thought about the single green sprout the old tree had described in his last message, small and pale and stubborn. He thought that somewhere, in whatever version of this story got written down eventually, whether by Eileen's careful hand or by no one at all, because battles ended, kings changed, armies marched and eventually marched home again, one way or another, the way every army in every world he'd ever lived in eventually did. But roots, once they took hold properly, once they were given enough patience and enough water, and enough people willing to kneel down and listen, simply kept growing. He didn't know how long his own part in this particular story would last, whether the crown would eventually come to terms with what had happened here. He found, sitting there in the quiet with Mayraid's hand in his and the earth humming steadily beneath the porch step, that the question didn't frighten him the way it once had. Whatever came, the network was already too wide, too deep, too alive to be undone by any single decree written in a palace that had spent 300 years pretending the ground beneath it wasn't. He had been sent to Plot 47 to die quietly, forgotten. One more gray-marked failure the kingdom never expected to hear from again. After the first hard winter finished the job for them, instead he had become exactly what his gift had always quietly insisted he was. Not a farmer sent away in shame, but a gardener standing at the center of a world finally learning. And that, more than any title, any victory, any war either won or still waiting to be fought, was the single truest thing anyone could have said about him by the end of it all. Mare finally broke the long silence between them, asking, in the same practical tone she used for everything, whether he actually meant it about the sunflowers he'd mentioned back in the spring. He said he did, without a moment of hesitation. She said if the seeds existed anywhere in this kingdom, someone on this farm would find them eventually. He laughed quietly at that, the first real, easy laugh he'd allowed himself in days, and felt the tension he'd been carrying since Steele Hawthorne's letter finally loosen a little in his chest. Above them, the sky had gone the deep blue-gray of early night. No stars yet, but clearer than it used to be. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, one of the strays that had followed the villages in over the past year. Daniel thought that a barking dog, ordinary and unremarkable as it was, would have seemed like an impossible miracle a year and a half ago. Now it was just part of the evening, one more small, unremarkable proof that a wasteland the crown had written off 60 years ago was slowly, patiently, becoming somewhere worth actually living. He squeezed Mayraid's hand once, and she squeezed back, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, letting the sound of the settling farm speak for both of them instead. Eventually she stood, saying morning would come early regardless of how long they sat out here talking about beans and sunflowers and everything else that made an ordinary evening feel worth having. He stood too, and together they walked back inside, past Tyrant still counting for the delighted village child, past Ren setting his last bucket down for the night, past Kara resting on her finished wall. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and someone, probably Ren, had already banked the coals for morning, the same small, practiced kindness that had become as ordinary here as breathing. Daniel paused once more at the door before going in, looking east one last time, past the fields, past the villages, toward a rift he couldn't see from here but could feel humming faintly. He thought about the trees standing guard over it, roots buried deep in poison rock, holding a bridge open between the surface world and something ancient that had finally been given permission to heal. He thought about the sprout Brahm had described, small and pale and impossibly stubborn, breaking through ash at the very edge of a wound that had bled monsters for 60 straight years. He said nothing out loud. He didn't need to. He went inside, and the door shut quietly behind him, and the settlement kept breathing the way it always did now, steady and alive. Morning came the way it always did on Green Furrow now, gray at first, then slowly gold. The sun climbing over fields that had once been nothing but ash stretching flat to every horizon. Daniel woke before the others, the way he had every single morning since the very first day, and walked out into a field that no longer needed him to prove it could survive. It survived on its own now, roots reaching into roots, seeds waking seeds. A network too wide for any single person, gift, or crown to ever fully control again. He knelt anyway, the way he always did, and pressed his palm flat against the ground, feeling for the steady pulse that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past. It answered, warm and even, the way it always answered now, patient and unhurried, exactly the way something that had survived 300 years of silence had every right to be. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked out at everything that had grown from a single crooked hut, and a sack of government seeds no one had ever expected to sprout. Wheat, beans, rye waiting for next season. A schoolhouse bell that rang every morning now instead of silence. Children who had never once seen this land as anything but green. He thought, standing there in the early gold light, that this was probably as close to an ending as any story like his ever really got. Not a final victory. Behind him, the door opened, and Mayer stepped onto the porch with 2 cups of something warm, handing him one without a word. They stood together at the edge of the field, watching the light spread slowly across ground that used to be dead, and neither of them needed to say what they were both quietly thinking. It had been worth it, all of it. It had been worth it because the ground beneath their feet was alive again, and because alive, once it truly takes hold, has a way of refusing to ever be silenced quite that completely again. Tyron came out a while later, already talking, already counting something new before he'd even finished rubbing the sleep from his eyes. And Daniel listened with the patience of someone who had learned long ago. Soyen appeared from wherever she'd spent the night, silent as always, and took her place near the fire without anyone needing to ask where she'd been, or what she'd heard along the roads while everyone. Ren filled his buckets for the morning circuit. Kara inspected yesterday's wall for cracks that never appeared anymore, and Hannah's forge caught its first spark of the day, somewhere behind the settlement's growing rooftops. Eileen stepped out last, her book tucked under one arm, already planning the next chapter. The next quiet piece of truth she intended to send out into a world still learning how to hear it. One by one, the people who had all arrived here broken, disgraced, exiled, or hunted, gathered for another ordinary day of work that had somehow. Daniel looked at each of them in turn, Mayra beside him, Tyron mid-sentence, Soyen watching the gate, Ren already walking, Kara checking her stone, Hannah's forge glowing to life, Eileen with her book held close. None of them had been chosen for greatness. All of them had been sent here to disappear, quietly, without complaint, into a wasteland the kingdom had already decided was beyond saving. Instead, they had saved it together, one stubborn, patient season at a time, proving that a gift called useless by a crown afraid of what it might actually be capable of was never truly useless. He thought that if he ever did find his way back to that empty Oregon highway, to the jazz on the radio and the life he'd lived before all of this began. This was his life now. Dirt under his fingernails, a mark on his palm that still glowed faintly gray, and a family made entirely of people the rest of the world had once thrown away. He knelt one last time before the day's work began, pressed his palm to the warm, humming earth, and felt it answer the way it always did, steady, alive. He stood, finally, and the whole farm moved into motion around him, the way it did every single morning now, unstoppable, quiet, and utterly certain of what it was building toward. Far to the east, past kilometers of ground that had once been nothing but gray, the red line of the rift kept fading day by day, and beneath every single acre of the wasteland, connected now by threads too numerous to count, the first root kept climbing steadily toward daylight, patient, ancient, and finally, after 300 years no longer alone, Daniel picked up his tools and walked out into the field, ready for another ordinary day in a life that had started, impossibly, with a stranger's body and a mark the world once called shameful. He had learned, over a year and a half, that shame and gift were never the same thing, and that the world's judgment of a man's worth rarely matched the worth that man could actually. The wind moved gently across the wheat, carrying nothing but the ordinary smell of turned soil and warm bread, and somewhere behind him, Mayor called his name, laughing about something Tyron had just said. He turned toward the sound of it, toward the life he had built entirely from soil, patience, and people no one else had ever wanted, and understood, fully and finally, exactly what he had become. Not a hero, not a savior. That evening, when the day's work finally slowed, Eileen read a new passage aloud by the fire, her voice steadier than it had ever been during her first anxious months on the farm. She wrote that the crown had built its power on silence, 300 years of it, and that silence, once broken properly, was almost impossible to force back into the ground it came from. Steele Hawthorne's letters kept arriving through that autumn too, steady now, less guarded, describing a slow, quiet shift moving through garrisons that had once followed orders without ever once asking why. He wrote that the war he'd once warned Daniel about hadn't fully arrived, and might never arrive in the shape either of them had originally feared, because truth, moving quietly enough. Daniel understood by then that some battles simply weren't won in a single dramatic clash of steel and spears. He didn't know exactly how the larger story with the crown would eventually end, and for the first time since waking up in a stranger's body, what he did know, with total certainty, was that the ground beneath Green Furrow would keep growing regardless of what the capital eventually decided, because roots, once given water and patience. Winter approached again that year, softer than either of the two before it, and the settlement prepared for it the way it had learned to prepare for everything, together, and without panic. Grain reserves stood higher than they'd ever been. Compost circles ringed every field for kilometers. The villages tied to Green Furrow shared what they had freely, the way neighbors had always been meant to. Daniel stood at the edge of his original 3 acres one last time, before the season turned fully cold, remembering the boy who had knelt there in the ash. That boy hadn't disappeared exactly. He'd simply grown into something larger, the way every good seed eventually does, given enough patience, enough water, and enough people willing to kneel beside him and help. He placed his palm against the ground one final time that evening, and felt the whole living network answer back, warm, steady, and endlessly, patiently, alive beneath every acre it now touched. The earth had waited 300 years for someone willing to listen, and it would keep growing, long after this particular chapter closed, because that, more than any crown or any war, was simply what living things had always been built to do. Snow never fell in the wastelands. It never had. But that winter the frost came thin and gentle instead of biting, and the wheat held firm beneath it without a single stalk lost. Mayer spent the coldest nights teaching to more village women everything she knew, saying openly now that Green Furrow needed more healers than just one, no matter how much she'd once resisted admitting that. Daniel spent those same nights by the fire with Tyron and Eileen, planning the spring planting, mapping which fields would take rye, which would take the new hybrid grasses Brahm had once described from memory. Somewhere east, past kilometers of quietly greening wasteland, a 200-year-old tree stood alone at the edge of a healing wound, roots buried deep, patient, unmoving, exactly where he had chosen to remain forever. He sent his nightly pulse through the root line as he always did, one long, steady signal, meaning simply that the connection below still held, that the earth was still listening, still growing, still alive. Daniel answered the same way he always did, warmed past hand to root again, a promise renewed every single evening without exception. And so the second winter passed on Green Furrow much like the first, quietly, patiently, one warm loaf and one honest conversation at a time. The kingdom above still hadn't decided what to do about a green light in the wasteland. It could no longer explain away or ignore. But underground, where the real decision had already been made months ago, roots kept reaching toward roots, patient and certain, exactly the way they always had. Daniel stood at his window one last quiet evening before spring, watching frost settle gently over fields that used to be nothing but ash and silence. He thought of everything that single mark on his palm had grown into, and felt, for the first time in either of his two lives, completely and simply at peace. Then he turned from the window, walked toward the fire, and toward the family waiting for him there, ready for whatever the next season decided to bring. That evening Mayer came out to the porch and sat close beside him, saying they needed to move the beans to the southern strip in the morning, nothing urgent, just the usual work. She said Wren had found a new source of clay near the river, good for pots, better than anything they'd been using, and that Tyron had counted exactly 10,000 grains in the morning batch. He'd been so proud of that particular number, she said, that he'd repeated it to absolutely everyone on the farm at least twice before lunch. Daniel listened and nodded along, and something about the ordinariness of it, beans and clay, and a boy proud of an exact count. The earth beneath his palm hummed quietly and steadily in response, the same way it had for months now, patient and alive and entirely unbothered by politics or armies. He looked over at Mayra, green eyes, freckles catching the last of the firelight, a small, quiet smile she rarely let show all the way. He told her that next year, if the season allowed it, he wanted to try rye, and maybe sunflowers too, if seeds could be found anywhere within reach. She said she'd find them, she always did, one way or another. And he'd stopped doubting that particular promise a long time ago. Around them, Green Furrow settled slowly toward sleep. 12 acres grown to something far larger now. 30 people grown to something closer to 100. 14 sentient trees standing watch over it all. A blacksmith shop. A bakery. A school built from stone that used to be a wall no one thought could hold. An infirmary that had delivered its first baby that very autumn. A small, stubborn world that had begun with nothing more than a crooked hut. A sack of government seeds. And a boy from another life entirely who knew exactly one thing worth knowing. The earth is alive. And if someone is patient enough to actually listen, it will answer. Far to the east, past kilometers of ground that used to be gray and was now threaded through with green, Brahm stood alone at the edge of the rift in the dark. His roots reached 200 meters down through the bridge he had given his own body to hold, through the poison rock, into the first root itself, into the earth's deepest memory. He felt everything from where he stood. Every green thread rising to the surface across the entire wasteland. Every dormant seed finally shaking off 60 years of sleep. Every kilometer of dead land quietly, patiently ceasing to be dead. He turned his eye like growths west, toward a small green light today's journey away that never once, not on the worst night, had gone completely dark. His farm, his gardener, his neighbors, still awake at this hour, still talking about beans and clay and rice seed, as if the whole world hadn't nearly ended a dozen times already. He lowered his branches slowly until his leaves brushed the gray soil at his own roots. And where they touched, something small pushed up out of the ash for the very first time. A single green sprout, tender and pale, rising at the very edge of the rift itself. the first living thing to grow there in 60 full years of war. Brahm looked down at it for a long, quiet moment, the way an old man looks at something he has waited his entire long life to finally see. And in a slow, creaking voice that no one else was there to hear, he said the only word that had ever really mattered from the very beginning. One boy, one seal, one stubborn seed, and the whole gray world learned how to grow.